I feel like I should invite you all to stand up and like shake around and move around a little bit. Go ahead. You can, Peter. You really can. It was a long one, wasn't it? Turn around, move around, do the hokey pokey and turn yourself around. And I'm priming you up because I'm going to try something new with you guys this morning. You can still stand if you want. I hear a little voice somewhere, and I hope that little voice can run around and be free and be comfortable. That's what we're all about here. I want to try something new, which is an interactive sermon. So don't fail me, my friends. Don't fail me. So I'm going to ask you, what did you guys hear? What did you see in that story today? Anyone? Anyone at all? And I'll repeat what you say for the people at home. Just yell it out. Paradox. Faith. Love. What else did we see? A lot of sass for authority, praise be to God. Figurative blindness. Pride. Old-fashioned rules. Gosh darn it. What else have we got? Yeah, it sounds like a story we really want to hear now, doesn't it? Right? I'm going to tell you a story for a minute about a local story, a more timely story, a story that you might remember more than you might remember that Bible story, although it is a common one. It was in May of 2015. Seacoast Family Promise is an organization we've been supporting here in Newmarket Community Church for quite some time. It's a program where people who are experiencing homelessness can find a home temporarily until they can find and sustain long-term housing. We've been supporting the program, for probably 8 years or so, 7 years or so maybe. Jim, my husband, and I have been supporting the program for 15 years or so. And it's a program where people are housed, and prior to COVID, families who are experiencing homelessness, and that to get into the program, you had to have children. You have to have children. And the families would spend a week at a time in different churches for a period of time while they get back on their feet. And the host churches provide meals and housing, and we had lots of fun doing that. We got to meet lots of people. We got to have sleepovers and slumber parties in the church office, trying to make those sound more fun than they were. But we got to know people. We got to experience what life was like for people who were unable to sustain housing at that time. And we heard many, many, many success stories. They have a success rate of that program where people come into the program, move through the program, and out of the program, and maintain their housing of somewhere in the 90s is their success rate. Very good. In 2015, the organization was planning to move from their home office in Stratham Community Church to a freestanding day center, is what they call it, in Exeter. And after 5 hours of emotional testimony from the area neighbors, we heard things like, not in their neighborhood. They didn't want to jeopardize the security and safety of their families. They didn't want to jeopardize the value of their homes. As the neighbors fought hard against Seacoast Family Promise moving into their day center in the residential area that they were hoping to be in. Praise be to God, Seacoast Family Promise moved into that building. I don't think it was a proud moment for the families in Exeter or the town of Exeter. I remember reading the article and wincing at the thought of it. Flash forward to 2020, and Seacoast Family Promise, because of the pandemic, of course, churches were no longer open to housing their families. They had to find something new and different to do. And so what they did is they bought the Joshua House in Greenland. The Joshua House became the residential facility for the organization where families would, instead of moving from church to church, stay right there in the Joshua House. And churches, as we've been doing for the last 3 years, would provide meals to them, dinner meals and so forth. When they were purchasing the Greenland property, they had a similar exchange. All these years, and we still don't learn sometimes. What is it about us? What is it that tends to have us not trust a certain set or group of people that we believe or have beliefs of? Why is it that we think that we might not be able to trust people who are experiencing homelessness? Where does that come from? We limit the possibility of what we believe certain groups of people are actually capable of. Well, in our story today, the story from John, Jesus was what? A homeless rabbi, wasn't he? He didn't have a home. And if we look at and hear and listen to the story that we heard in the Gospel of John, he got about as much trust as the people and families who were experiencing homelessness in Exeter in 2015, did he not? We saw and heard all those things that you shared. Thank you for being interactive, for sharing what you saw. We saw a community fail. We saw a family fail. And we saw religious leaders fail. A community who lived with this man who had been blind since birth, living in that same community. Suddenly, he can see, and people don't even recognize him. As if the only recognizable fact about this man was that he was blind. So suddenly his eyes are open, and people say, "Is that really him?" That's not really him. We see a family so overwrought with fear that they themselves will be kicked out of the temple, which is what happened to him, that they say, yeah, well, we know he was blind from birth. Of course, we can affirm and attest to that. But beyond that, we're not saying a thing because, man, the temple was their whole community. It was where they did everything. To be kicked out was horrible. And we see religious leaders who rule their way out. They have a miracle right smack in front of them, right? Right there. Well, it was done on the Sabbath. Well, he was a sinner from birth. Why would we listen to him? A sinner, so would he sin in the womb? I mean, come on. Right smack in front of them. And they make these excuses to not see. Or they're so focused on their rules. What did you call them? Old-fashioned rules? They couldn't see. It seems like the only trustworthy people in this story were Jesus himself, of course, and the blind man. Because those religious leaders are trying to get that blind man to say, he's a sinner. And he says, I don't know if he's a sinner. I can't speak to that. That's all I know is, look, I couldn't see and now I can see. And, can you imagine what it felt like to be him? He can't see. For the first time in his life, he can see. Imagine. We can't even imagine because we see what color looks like. We see what the world looks like. We've seen faces. The first thing he opens his eyes and the faces he sees are looking at him scornfully. He never dreamed that would be what he sees. Of course, he can't say much about the guy who healed him because, let's face it, he was blind when he healed him. He didn't see him, right? I don't know who he was. He spit in the mud. He rubbed mud in my eyes. And he didn't ask to be healed. He was just there. Interesting part of the story. He didn't ask to be healed. He didn't say he believed before he was healed. He just was there, blind. Jesus just did what Jesus did. And the faith came after the healing. Interesting. I think this story in John is another one, kind of like last week when Chris did the marathon reading and today Noreen did the marathon reading. I could preach on this story for a long time because there's so many facets of it. But for this morning, I'd like to say I think we're invited into this blindness. The blindness that we experience in the man is more than just a symbol of a lack of faith, a symbol for us, a blindness to Jesus. But we're invited into that blindness to experience or wonder what that might have been like and to recognize our own blindness. All I know is I was blind, but now I see. I heard a story about the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, shoot, I should have told you who I was talking about after I told you the story. Darn it. He was about 9 years old. It was winter, and he was walking through a field with his uncle. And boy, am I dying to walk around to show you what it was like, but I can't. I'm trying to stay in the camera zone, so working hard on that, Hillary. But he was walking along with his uncle, trudging through the snow. Imagine a field with lots of things in it, and when they got to their destination, his uncle said to him, "Turn around and look. Look at the path that the two of us walked." The uncle's path was straight from point A to point B, going directly to his goal. And the boy's path meandered along. It kind of stopped at the fence and looked at the cattle and moved around and looked at some trees. And, it was kind of like the butterfly through the field, more so, stopping here and there. And the uncle's lesson was, obviously, how much time he had wasted. Instead of going from point A to point B, he fluttered around, taking in all that was available to him in that moment. And it said from that moment that message was not lost on the boy. And it was from that moment that he decided to make darn sure he would be stopping to see, stopping to look. I think that's a really fabulous story because wouldn't you have thought the message was to be more efficient, right? To get from point A to point B very quickly. But that wasn't the message at all. Even if it was what the uncle intended. In this story today, Jesus healed a man. His community, his family, his religious leaders failed the man. He was kicked out of the temple. And what happened next? This is another interactive part if any of you caught it, and I won't. It was a long story. It was Jesus went back to him. It was Jesus who went and stood with him in his isolation. It was Jesus that went to him. Oftentimes, especially for people like me, the blue-eyed type, when we're out in bright light, it's very difficult. And so, I can't stand bright light. I'll be squinting, and I always have to put on sunglasses. Right? This is our human way of dealing with things. We put on our shades, we squint, we put on our shades. But my friends, I leave you with this ridiculous visual. In case you can't see it. To say, we are standing in the midst of the light of the world. Take off the ridiculous sunglasses. It's time to see, to really see Jesus in our midst. May it be so. Amen.